But we begin in Spain, where President Biden is meeting with NATO allies.
That's right. The alliance is growing. Turkey is dropping its objection, paving the way for Finland and Sweden to join NATO. The expansion deals a direct blow to Russia while strengthening the defense bloc's presence in Europe. President Biden met with Turkish President Erdogan today. The two discussed NATO's expansion, along with several other issues. Earlier, President Biden expressed his gratitude to President Erdogan for his role in allowing Finland and Sweden to join the alliance.
I want to particularly thank you for what you did putting together the situation with regard to Finland and Sweden and all the incredible work you're doing to try to get grain out of Ukraine and Russia. I mean, you're doing a great job. I just want to thank you.
CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now with more from Madrid. So, Nancy, NATO is welcoming the addition of Finland and Sweden to the alliance after Turkey dropped its opposition on Tuesday. How significant a breakthrough is this, and what exactly does it mean?
Hi, Elaine. Well, it is the biggest expansion in NATO's membership in nearly 20 years. NATO will be going from 30 to 32 member countries. And beyond the numbers, what various White House officials we talked to stress is the message that this sends to Vladimir Putin, that his attempts to destabilize or divide NATO have actually backfired, have not only caused NATO to grow in size, but also the member countries that already exist are spending more on defense than they had been 6 months ago. President Biden announced new force deployments today, meaning he's going to be sending even more military might to the region. A short time ago, I spoke to National Security Council spokesman John Kirby about the significance of Sweden and Finland in particular joining NATO. And he argued that even beyond the fact that these are two countries that have been famously neutral for decades, now rushing to join this security alliance, these are also two countries with significant militaries. They are countries that the U.S. sells weaponry to and has good relationships with. And what this also means, Elaine, is that overnight, NATO's border with Russia is going to more than double because Finland alone has an 800-mile border with Russia. And so that's going to mean strategic changes for the alliance and logistical changes for the alliance that this group that's meeting here in Madrid is going to have to spend some time thinking through.
Well, speaking of strategy going forward, Nancy, Ukrainian President Zelensky is calling for NATO to do more in his country's fight against Russia. What issues specifically is President Zelensky having with the alliance? What more does he need in terms of support? And does it look likely the alliance is ready to give it to him?
Tanya, President Zelensky spoke with NATO leaders remotely today via teleconference. And it's not so much that he has an issue with NATO. It's that he just wants more artillery in particular. He was very grateful for all the assistance that he's gotten so far. I mean, the U.S. alone has committed $5.6 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. But he argues that Russia still has a massive artillery advantage, just an order of magnitude more weaponry at its disposal than Ukraine does. And so the case that he was making to NATO leaders is that if you want to break Russia's artillery advantage, if you want to have a hope of bringing this war to a swifter end, that Ukraine is just going to need far more artillery. Now, this is the summit where various nations are making public commitments to Ukraine, announcing what they're going to do, not just for Ukraine itself, but around Ukraine, positioning more weaponry, positioning more troops on the border with Russia in various NATO countries like the Baltic states, Poland, Romania. It's become a familiar pattern for Zelensky at summits like this one. He is going to continue to push these leaders to do more and more and more.
So even as Ukraine remains the focus for NATO, the U.S. at the same time is also focusing on North Korea. President Biden is looking to get the cooperation of South Korea and Japan in preventing North Korea from achieving nuclear capabilities. Nancy, what more do we know about how their discussion went today?
Well, this was a really interesting development, Elaine. After all, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 30 countries, primarily here in Europe, but also the U.S. and Canada. It really typically doesn't have anything to do with the Indo-Pacific. And yet the president made a point of inviting the leaders of Japan and South Korea, who he just met with a little over a month ago on an Asian trip. But he's meeting with them again, both to send a message about how serious these three countries are about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But also, I think the subtext here is really sending a message to China about how united this group of countries, not just the U.S. and South Korea and Japan that were here, but also New Zealand and Australia, how strong that alliance is becoming as a sort of counterweight in the region to China. And that coincides with a new strategic concept that NATO is putting out. This is something that they only do once every 10 years, sort of establishing what their goals and challenges are going to be for the coming decade. And for the first time, this strategic concept is really mentioning China and describing China as a challenge that NATO is facing. The White House wanted that strategic concept to go even a little further, perhaps more muscular language than challenge. European nations weren't as keen to do that. They have very significant economic relationships with China. But nevertheless, I think that meeting that you saw today with the leaders of Japan and South Korea, along with this new strategic concept, is designed to send a message that even as this alliance is focused on Russia and the war in Ukraine, they are still aware of the challenges that are posed by China's leadership and influence in the world, and they're not going to take their eye off of that either.
All right, Nancy Cortez in Madrid, we thank you so much for joining us. Let's bring in Robert Bell now for more on this. He's a distinguished professor of practice at international affairs at Georgia Tech and a former defense advisor to the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Bob, welcome. Great to have you with us. So, as we were saying, NATO has formally invited Finland and Sweden to join the alliance. Tell us what their membership specifically will mean for NATO's overall strength.
I think it's a pretty big deal, certainly in three different respects. First, it's a huge strategic setback and counter to Putin in terms of his overall objectives in invading Ukraine, where he was seeking to divide and weaken NATO. He's ending up with a larger and stronger NATO. Second, these two countries bring significant military assets into the alliance. The Finns have, between their active and reserve forces, almost a 1 million-man army. Both countries are extremely well equipped, extremely capable in all aspects of warfighting, and have been partnering with NATO in many ways for many years, so they're fully interoperable. And then last, just in terms of sort of the northern region within NATO itself, it completely reshuffles the deck in terms of the strategic alignments in that part of the globe, if you will. The Russian enclave in Kaliningrad now sort of finds itself with NATO member states on all sides. It's a different perspective. And then you have to note as well, I think, that this case study in getting these two countries in shows that although NATO has this consensus rule, and it's very unwieldy and frustrating at times, at the end of the day, all countries, in this case Turkey, was able to work through diplomacy to get to a point where all parties were satisfied. And I think that's reaffirming in terms of the basic principles of how NATO works.
Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging NATO to supply additional military aid to his country as the war with Russia continues. On Monday, the G7 alliance pledged its unwavering support for Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. Do you expect to hear a similar pledge from NATO at the end of the summit?
I think there's words pretty much to that effect in the strategic concept that's just been released by NATO headquarters in the last minutes or hour or so. It was approved this afternoon. Of course, declaring as long as it lasts in words in a policy document, while it's totally appropriate and commendable, now you have to put your money where your mouth is, if you will, because it will be difficult for the West to maintain this level of sanctions and economic dislocation. There will be issues that tug at your heartstrings, like the world food crisis. So there will be a lot of strain on that resolve as people want to try to find some way to negotiate a solution. So NATO will have to find that appropriate balance to be resolute and fully supportive, and yet still take advantage of any opportunity if the battlefield situation allows to negotiate an end to the conflict, which is the way Zelensky himself has said is the only way that this conflict can end.
Well, to your point that Russia is sort of the main area of concern right now, but certainly not the only one that will be discussed on the docket today. There are growing concerns within the alliance over China's economic and military reach, climate change, the global effects of that, and an increased emphasis on cybersecurity. So, Bob, in your opinion, what's the biggest threat to the NATO alliance at this point in time?
Well, the wolf that's at the door is clearly Russia. And I think the strategic concept makes that clear, while also being very careful to underscore that that's not the only threat, or in the case of China, challenge that NATO faces. Certainly the countries along the Mediterranean within NATO, led by Spain, the host of this summit, want NATO to maintain a priority focus on threats, if you will, from the south, refugee flows, smuggling, terrorism, instability. So NATO is always trying to make clear that it has a 360-degree, if you will, security perspective. And while it's going to prioritize Russia because of the immediacy of this crisis and the stakes involved, it's been very careful in this strategic concept to not depreciate the other challenges that it confronts.
Good points.
A number of challenges at this particular moment. Bob Bell, Bob, thank you very much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
My pleasure.